Welcome back to another video, guys. Today we have 5 disturbing Reddit stories. I hope you guys do enjoy these stories. Make sure to show some support, subscribe, like the video, share it to others, and yeah, submit some stories, guys, because I'd love to do a video featuring your guys' stories. So yeah, show some support and more videos on the way, so let's get right into it. If you find an old photograph hidden in a book, don't just ignore it. I've never been a big believer in the paranormal or anything like that, but something happened to me a few years ago that I still can't explain. It all started when I moved to this small town after getting a new job. I was fresh out of college and ready to start my life. I found a small, affordable apartment in an older part of town. It was the kind of place where the buildings were peeling and it had this weird old school charm to it. So I'm unpacking my stuff, and as I'm putting my books on a shelf, a photo falls out of one of the books. It was weird because I had bought the book secondhand from a little shop in another town, and I had never noticed anything inside it before. The photo was old and a little faded, but it was clear enough to see what it was. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 kids. They were standing in front of a house in the picture. I don't know why, but something about the house in the background caught my attention. It looked so familiar to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen it before, and then it hit me. The house in the photo was across the street from my apartment. I mean, it wasn't identical since some renovations had clearly been made over the years, but the structure and key details were unmistakable. At first I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe the previous owner of the book had lived in the town at some point. But the more I thought about it, the more curious I got. So one evening, after debating with myself for hours, I decided to go knock on the door of the house from the photo. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I figured I'd ask if they recognized the picture. A woman answered the door, probably in her late 40s. She seemed normal enough, but when I showed her the photo, her face changed instantly. She looked shaken, like she had seen a ghost. Her face and hands trembled slightly, and she took the photo from me and studied it. Then, without even looking up, she asked, "Where did you get this?" I explained about the book, how I had found it randomly while unpacking, and asked if it was her family in the picture. She hesitated for a long moment, and I started to feel really awkward just standing there. Finally, she looked up, and her eyes were filled with something like fear. "That's my family," she said quietly, "but my husband and children have been dead for over 10 years now." At that moment, I didn't know what to say. I just stood there trying to process what she had just told me. Her kids and husband were dead? What was I supposed to say to that? I think I managed to stutter out an apology, but she just shook her head and handed the photo back to me quickly before shutting the door. I stood there on her porch for a while, just staring at the closed door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't add up. How did a photo of her family end up in a random book that I bought from a shop in another town? The whole thing just felt wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that woman and her reaction. Something about it didn't sit right with me, so the next morning I decided to dig a little deeper. I went to the local library and I searched through the old newspaper archives. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I figured if her family had died in an accident or something, it would be in the local news. Sure enough, I found an article from over a decade ago about a tragic car accident. The article said that a man and his 2 young children had been killed when the car swerved off the road during a storm. The wife had survived, but barely. The details matched what the woman had told me, and I felt this weird feeling like I knew it was true. But then I saw the date. The accident had happened on the exact same day that I had bought the book with the photo inside of it. I remember because I had bought that book as a last-minute gift for my friend's birthday, and it had been on the same evening that I got a call about my new job offer. At this point, I was feeling seriously creeped out. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow I had been meant to find that photo. But why and how? Was it just an insane coincidence, or was there something more to this story? I eventually moved away from that town after a year, but the whole thing kinda still haunts me. Every now and then I pull the photo out and I look at it, wondering what really happened. I've thought about going back and asking the woman more about the family, but something just tells me to leave it alone. Whatever the reason, that photo ended up with me for a reason, and I'm not sure if I want to find out why or what the point of me ever buying that book was. If you ever get on the wrong bus, be ready to jump off. Back when I was in college, I used to rely on public transportation a lot, especially since I didn't have a car at the time. This happened during my sophomore year, and it's something I've never been able to fully explain. It was a Friday evening, and I had been studying late at the library for a midterm that I had the following week. By the time I left, it was nearly 11 p.m. The bus that I usually took there was one of those old rattly ones, no air conditioning, creaky seats, the whole deal. I remember feeling exhausted and zoning out as I waited at the bus stop. The bus finally pulled up, and as usual, there were a couple people on board. There was a middle-aged woman sitting near the front and an older man a few rows behind her. I took a seat somewhere in the middle and put my headphones in, tried to unwind after a long day. About 15 minutes into the ride, I started noticing something weird. The bus driver kept looking at me in the rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it, but after a few more glances, it became really obvious. He was staring at me like he was trying to figure something out. Then out of nowhere, the bus came to a sudden stop. We were in the middle of a quiet street, no bus stop, no reason to pull over at all. I looked around, and that's when I noticed the two other passengers were gone. Just gone. I hadn't heard them get off, and I definitely didn't see them leave. The bus hadn't even stopped at any designated stops yet. I felt a knot in my stomach as I stood up and walked toward the front of the bus. The driver was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. I asked him why he had stopped, but he didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and shaky. "You weren't supposed to be here," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached over and opened the door, gesturing me to get off of the bus. At this point, my heart was beating out of my chest, and I just wanted to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack and I stepped off the bus. As soon as my feet hit the pavement, the bus doors slammed shut and the driver sped off down the road, leaving me standing there in the absolute middle of nowhere. I turned around and saw that there was another bus coming down the street toward me. It was newer, cleaner, and it looked much more modern than the one I had just gotten off. The bus pulled up and I got on, still feeling shaken from whatever had just happened. This time, the bus was almost full of passengers and everything seemed normal. I sat down and asked the driver if he had seen that other bus that had just dropped me off. He gave me a confused look and said there hasn't been another bus on this route for over an hour. I didn't know what to say. I had just been on that bus, an old, beat up one, and yet this driver was still telling me it didn't exist. I rode the rest of the way home in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I asked around about the old bus that I had been on the day before, but no one seemed to know what I was even talking about. I even went to the local bus depot to see if any other old buses were in rotation at this point in time. The guy at the counter looked at me like I was crazy and said that they hadn't used those models in years. He told me that the question I was asking was so stupid, and why would we be using older buses if the city had funded us to get all new buses? To this day, I still have no idea what happened. That old bus, the disappearing passengers, the driver's strange behavior, it all felt like a dream, but I know it was real. I've told a few people about it over the years, but no one seems to believe me. They all say I must have had been a late night hallucination or something, but I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. I somehow know that I ended up on a bus that wasn't supposed to be there, and I still can't remember if this was real life like I think it was, but maybe I was dreaming. I honestly don't know, and I will never know, so I hope you guys find the story interesting, and hopefully you guys can give me some feedback on what you think happened that night. When a stranger keeps saying you know them, run. This happened about 5 years ago, and honestly, I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. At first it seemed like one of those simple wrong numbers situations, but it became something so much stranger. It started with a text from a number that I didn't recognize. The message said something simple like, "Hey, it's me, can we talk?" My first thought was that it was the wrong number, so I replied something like, "Sorry, I think you have the wrong person." A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. No, I don't. That was weird. I figured it was maybe a prank or someone being persistent, but there was something so unsettling about the whole thing. I asked who it was, and the reply was almost immediate. "You know who I am." At this point, I was more annoyed than creeped out. I texted back something like, "No, I don't. Stop texting me." They didn't respond right away, and I thought that was the end of it. But later that night, I got another message. "I'm serious. You know me. Why are you pretending you don't?" I was home alone at the time, and for the first time, I started feeling genuinely freaked out. I thought about blocking the number, but my curiosity got the better of me. I asked again, "Who is this? How do I know you?" They replied, "You'll figure it out soon." Now my heart was pounding, and I stared at my phone trying to figure out what was going on. Could this be someone I knew who had changed their number? Was it a stalker? Was it a prank? I didn't want to deal with it anymore, so I blocked the number and tried to put it out of my mind. For the next few days, nothing happened. I started to forget about the whole thing. But then about a week later, I got a call from a different number. The area code was local, but I didn't recognize it. When I answered, a voice on the other end simply said, "I told you, you know who I am." The voice was male. It was a deep voice, but it was oddly familiar, like I had heard this person before. I felt instantly freaked out, so I immediately hung up. Within seconds, the phone rang again. It was the same number. I didn't answer, and now I was officially freaked out. I blocked that number too, but the calls and texts kept coming from different numbers, always the same message, "You know who I am." I started asking friends if they were playing a prank on me, but no one knew what I was talking about. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who this person was and how they knew me or how they even got my number in the first place. The messages would show up at random times during the day, and the more they sent, the more unsettling that they became. One text said, "You can't avoid me forever." Another one said, "I'll see you soon." I kept blocking numbers, but it was like playing whack-a-mole. They always came back with a new one. I even contacted my phone company, but they couldn't help me with this issue. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That someone was texting me from different numbers claiming I knew them? It sounded ridiculous even to me, so I knew bringing it up to law enforcement was just going to be a waste of time. The breaking point came about a month after the first text. I got a message that simply said, "Look outside." I was home alone again late at night, and I started to feel freaked out the second I received the text. I hesitated, and my hand was shaking now as I unlocked my phone. The message popped up, and it again said, "Look outside." I didn't want to, but something compelled me to check. I walked over to the window and I peeked through the blinds, but the street outside was completely empty. There was no one there. But then another message popped up. "Nice PJs." I felt sick. Whoever this was, they could absolutely see me. My curtains were drawn, so they had to be close to the house, maybe even in my yard. I closed the blinds quickly and I turned off all the lights, and I sat in the corner of my room trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't know what to do, and I was so freaked out that felt like I was gonna pass out. The texts continued to come, but I never looked at them again. I got rid of my phone the next day, changed my number, and for a long time nothing happened. I thought it was over, that maybe I had escaped whatever nightmare I had found myself in. But then about a year later, I was out with some friends at a bar. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I immediately pulled it out to check, who texted me. It was a message from a new number. "I told you who I was." I now knew that this person was 100% a stalker, and I ended up blocking their number along with any new number that texted me. After a long time, I ended up not getting any more texts, and I think it was because I just didn't give in to them anymore. Whoever this was or whatever was going on, I'm glad it's over now, but during that time of my life, I couldn't tell you how scared I was on a daily basis. Check your childhood photos carefully. She might be in them too. It's funny how things come back to haunt you, even after you think you've moved on far from them. I grew up in a small town where nothing ever really happened, and I guess that's why something as small as a school field trip became a big deal to me. When I was around 12, Our class went on a trip to an old historical site, a mansion that had been preserved since the 1800s. We were given disposable cameras to take pictures, which I thought was cool at the time. This was before everyone had smartphones, so actually having a camera felt pretty special. I took a bunch of pictures of the mansion, my friends, some of the old furniture, typical kid stuff that you'd do if you had a disposable camera. A few weeks after the trip, I got the film developed. I remember flipping through those photos, laughing at the goofy faces my friends made, and reminiscing about the trip, thinking about how fun it was. But then when I got to the last photo, my laughter just stopped. There in the picture, standing behind one of my friends in the doorway, was a woman. She wasn't part of the tour group. Her clothes looked old, like something out of a black and white movie. She was staring directly at the camera. Her eyes were cold and blank. I had no memory of seeing her during the trip, so it really caught me out of alarm when I saw the picture. I showed the picture to my parents, but they brushed it off as a trick of the light or maybe another tourist who happened to walk into the frame. But I knew better. There was something about her, something that felt wrong. I took the photo to school and I showed it to all of my friends. One of them got really freaked out and said that the mansion was rumored to be haunted. Apparently a woman had died there decades ago under some mysterious circumstances. I didn't believe in ghosts, but that photo stuck with me. I kept it tucked away in a drawer, trying to forget about it. But every time I stumbled across it, I felt that same feeling, like she was watching me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence and that it was nothing supernatural, probably just a tourist or, a trick of the lighting. Fast forward to a few years ago, I had completely forgotten about the photo by then. But when my parents moved out of the house, I was tasked with helping them clean out the attic. As I was sorting through some old boxes, I came across my childhood stuff. There were books, toys, and of course that photo. I hadn't seen it in years, but as soon as I pulled it out, all of the memories came flooding right back. The woman was still there, just as creepy as I remembered she was. But this time something was different. When I looked closer, I realized that the woman's face had changed. Her expression was more defined. Her eyes looked more intense. It was almost like she had been moved. I tried to laugh it off, but there was no mistaking it. Her face was clearer than it had ever been before, like she had come into focus almost. I put the photo down because I started to sweat and feel uneasy. I couldn't stop staring at it, feeling like if I looked away, something bad would happen. I took the photo to a friend of mine who's into photography, hoping he could explain, what had happened. He scanned it into his computer, zooming in on the woman's face. We both sat there in silence, staring at the screen. She was definitely clearer than she should have been. My friend started asking me about the trip, who else was there, if anyone had come forward with similar photos, but I didn't know. I hadn't thought about it, a day in years, and I didn't have any explanation for what could even have happened. Eventually he told me that the photo hadn't been altered in any way, but he couldn't explain why her face had changed. I took the photo home and I shoved it back into the drawer, but that night I had the worst nightmare of my life. I dreamt that I was back in that mansion, walking through the halls alone. I could feel someone following me, but every time I turned around, no one was there. When I woke up, I decided I couldn't keep that photo anymore. I didn't want it in my house. I didn't want to look at it anymore, so I burned it. I watched as the flames consumed the paper, hoping it would take the memory of that woman with it. But even now, I still feel like that photo haunts me on my day-to-day life. If you hear a whisper in the vents, don't get closer. This happened to me a few years ago when I moved into my first apartment. It was a small, older place, but it was cheap, and as a broke college student, that was all I really cared about. The building itself had that creepy vintage vibe with creaky floors and old pipes that clanged in the walls at random times. I figured I could deal with it for the price I was paying at the time. I had only been living there for about a month when I started hearing things. It wasn't loud at first, just soft, almost unintelligible murmurs. They seemed to be coming from the air vents, which ran through the entire building. At first I assumed it was my neighbors, maybe voices from the apartment above or below mine, so I kinda just brushed it off as, something that was ordinary. But over the next few weeks, the murmurs got louder, and they seemed to get more clear. It started to sound like someone having a conversation in the vents. I couldn't make out exactly what was being said, but it was the same tone every time. Soft, almost like a whisper, but too faint for me to catch any distinct words. I asked my neighbors if they had heard anything strange, but none of them said they heard anything. One guy even laughed and said that I was probably just hearing the building settling because of how old it was. I tried to convince myself that he was right, but the more I heard it, the harder it was to ignore, especially because it would happen at similar times every single night. One night, as I was laying in bed just on the edge of sleep, I started to hear it again. This time, it was much louder and much more distinct. I got up and walked over to the vent in my living room, crouching down to listen more closely. I could hear a woman's voice, clear as day, and it was whispering something. It sounded like whoever this woman was asking for help. I started to freak out the second I heard that, but I decided to press my ear closer to the vent, trying to make out the words, but they were still too faint. I quickly grabbed my phone and I turned on the voice recorder, holding it up to the vent. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the faint, eerie whisper. Eventually the voice stopped and I was left in silence. The next day, I played back the recording, but it was just static. No voice, no whispering, nothing. I played it over and over, but there was no trace of what I had heard the night before. I started to wonder if I was losing it, if maybe the stress of school and work was messing with my head. But then, a few nights later, it happened once again. This time, it was much louder. I could hear the voice clearly, almost like she was right next to me. It was saying something like, "He's here, he's here." I honestly froze the second I heard it, and the voice was coming from the vent again, and it almost felt like it was coming out and surrounding me. I backed away and I tried to calm myself down. I was telling myself that it had to be the building. Old buildings make noise, right? Maybe the pipes were causing some weird sound, or maybe there was some old wiring or something. But deep down, I knew that that wasn't the case. I couldn't sleep that night, so I just sat there staring at the vent, waiting for the voice to come back. It never came back, and at least that night it didn't. For the next week, things were pretty quiet. I started to think that maybe I was just hearing things and that it was all in my head due to the stress of work and school and everything else kind of going on in my life. But then, once again, as I was lying in bed, I heard something new. It was a man's voice this time. It was deep and slow, but it was coming from that same vent. It was more distinct than before, and this time I could make out exactly what he was saying. "Come closer." I bolted upright in bed, and my heart was absolutely pounding out of my chest now. The voice had been so clear, so direct, that it felt like that person was in there with me. I grabbed my phone and I shined the flashlight around, but there was no one there. I felt a cold breeze, but the apartment was empty and there was no one in the room with me, obviously. I moved out a month later. I never told anyone about what happened. Not because I didn't think that they would believe me, but because I didn't want to admit how scared I had been. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if those voices were real, or if I was just imagining things. But I know deep down that there's no way they could have been fake. But the more I try to trick myself into believing that they weren't real, the more I feel like whatever happened in that apartment was really true. That is going to be the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed these stories. I had a fun time making these, and let me know what you guys want to see next. I appreciate all the support. You guys have really been killing it. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos and turn on those notifications because I'm be cranking out content in the next few months for you guys. So let's get it. Let's hit that goal. See you guys.